Welcome to this week's lecture. This week I will be talking about meaning and narrative in games, and to do so I will pair that information with the Tales of the Arabian Nights board game, which is based off of the book of the same title. The book follows the storyline of an individual, a woman who volunteers to be the bride of a prince. The prince has been finding wives and decapitating them every morning because he is bored with them. So, in volunteering, her goal is to entertain this prince with 1,001 different tales. So this game is utilizing a similar structure based in the Arabic and Persian world of storytelling, and we take on these character roles to travel throughout this world. So unlike other games, the design of this board game is really about the process of storytelling. We take on a character role, we can select from a couple of different roles, and we travel throughout the world of Eastern Europe, Northern Africa, and Asia. We go through various encounters, and in that process, we're sort of unfolding this story of our character as they travel throughout these worlds. So the game mechanics and the rules themselves are there to just structure the process of players telling a story of their character. Because the game is so narratively themed and connected to the Tales of Arabian Nights, there's a lot of cultural elements that are infused into the game structure itself. And to address this, the designers have actually built in language into the rule book that addresses Western audiences who have little previous contact with Arabic or Islamic culture. And they note that there are various references to the infidels, and to kill off somebody in the game is of no consequence if they are an infidel. They also note that in medieval Arabia, that the female sex gender was the lesser of the two, and so there are multiple interactions where the heroine can easily be seduced by men in certain cases, and there are often instances where you may gender switch in the game, but you cannot win the game if you have switched genders. Because of the game's heavy thematic elements and narrative structure and the relationship to these cultural elements, this game does provide a really great context to talk about narrative and some of the mechanics that it provides. And more importantly, not just the narrative structured by the game designers, but also the way that narrative develops out of the game, which is what we'll work to express here. To set up the game, we need to first establish the board, which is a really well designed board, as you see here, a lot of great production value. But one of the first things that we need to do in order to play the game is take a character card, which is what we'll do here. So for the sample case here, the selected player has chosen Ali Baba, which has these black little icons and tokens. This represents your character. You notice on this little icon here, you can start off with a gender, as previously talked about. You start off here with either a male or a female gender, and if you get sex changed in the game, you cannot win. So you would flip that over. All these markers as well give you different information on the board itself. So these serve as tracks, as markers for you. So Destiny, there's a Destiny track on the game. You have a wealth track. There's also a story track. And then on the left side, we have origins, quests, destinations. Those will be placed during the game as you pull over cards and tell you where to move. You have these simple little character icons, and that will represent your character on the game board itself. This marker also places your player aid throughout the game, which helps you reference different information. So as I said before, there's that destiny marker. So on the board, there's some track marks. On the left-hand side here, we have the destiny marker, and you will place your player's colored character destiny marker at the starting spot on it. And throughout the game, different events and different quests will reward you with destiny points. Once you receive those, you can move forward on this destiny track. When you get to space 3 and space 5, you get extra bonuses for your character. So this serves as a marker for your gameplay. And at the beginning of the game, your player group will decide how many destiny points do you want to go up to, or you can choose that randomly. So that's one of the win conditions that you need to have for this game. Another track system in this game that's built into the board is the wealth. And so you will place your character icon depending on who your character is. So for Alibaba, we start off on poor, and this dictates how far you can travel in the game. And so here we're able to travel 3 on land and 2 by sea. If you're also traveling by sea, you're able to carry more goods and resources, so you want to work your way up on this wealth track to be able to carry more goods. You'll also note that as you travel up on that wealth marker, you'll be able to travel further distances. The next track that's important to this game and reaching towards the end goal is that we have this story track here on this right side of the board. And again, much like the Destiny track, you're going to place your token on the start of it. and then you're going to work your way up as you get rewards in the game that reward you with story points. You'll move up on that track. Again, if you reach spot 3 and spot 5, you'll get bonus effects for your character. So depending on what storylines or quests you reach in the game, you're going to get different rewards. So greater tales and greater epics, more insane events that happen to you, more your story track will go up. And so these are the tracks that kind of orient you on the board. And then as you see on this board here, you're going to start off in Baghdad, and you're going to use your movement points to move throughout the world in different ways. So you might decide to go south into Northern Africa, and you're going to experience different events there. One of the last things you have to do, though, before you start your adventures is that there's an available set of skills. At the beginning of the game, you will select 3 skills for your character. These range in different areas from luck to magic to piety to quick thinking to beguiling. So all of these different things, you select 3 of these, and these will help you out throughout your quests and adventures. So sometimes you'll pull over a quest card when you adventure somewhere, and it'll say, if you have courtly graces, do this event. In addition to that, you can also start with basic skills, and then as you progress in the game, you flip a tile over, and then you get advanced skills. So these are a way to sort of help build your skills in the game, but they also allow you to develop your character style and your character play a little bit differently. So when I've played this game before, I've started off with a couple of different sets of skills, and that's allowed my character, my narrative storytelling of why my character acted in certain ways. And so again, that's one of the fun things about this game, is that the theme and the narrative storytelling really comes through if you're willing to play the character role. There's not a whole lot of skill in this game. It really is, though, based on how your character interacts with the world and the consequences of many of the events that they have. So again, this character has stealth and stealing, bargaining and evolution, and quick thinking. So some character actions they might do are going to be stealthy. They're going to sneak around more. They might be kind of sly and conniving to a certain extent. And so you want to embody that character role to help create the world for what your character would do in what situations. And it becomes more fun if you do play and stick to that story style. All right, so as you travel through the world and you go to different locations, you will get these adventure cards, and they will tell you to do different things. So in this instance, we are seeking love, and so there at the bottom it tells you to place your origin marker. You'll place that on the origin site of nearest to you, and then you'll go through the quest parameters. So this is one way that you start to seek and travel throughout the world. If you're able to complete this quest, then you're able to get different rewards. So that might be a skill set. You also then might move your destiny or your story marker up a couple of spots. So this is one way that you direct your player action. So this is the basic structure of the game. You're this character role, you're finding destiny cards, you're experiencing different locations, you're doing different quests and different things in this world, and you're traveling through to fill up your destiny and your storyline track markers. Different events are going to happen to you at different places. If you travel to North Africa, if you travel to Europe, there are different styles of quests and interactions that are going to happen to you. But the goal of the game essentially is to create this fantastic tale of your character, what has happened to them, and what has been going on in this world. So every player starts off in Baghdad, and you're going to then decide where you want to go depending on what your character story is. So for the game turns, there is a very unique element that this game has that other games don't, and that's in the quests, encounters, and what happens. So it's recommended that you play this game really with 3 people. It's available for more players, but 3 is a really good number because of the mechanics of telling the story come through and allow all the players to stay engaged as we tell the story together. So first, what we're going to do is we start off with our character in Baghdad, and we're going to roll, or we're going to take our movement points, sorry. We're going to move our character in whatever direction we decide to go based on those points. So starting off, I believe we have 3 land movements, and we're going to decide where we want to go in this land. So we decide maybe we want to try to work our way down towards Vantas, and so we're going to start our character movement in that direction. So we move as many spaces as we possibly can, and there's the city markers. They'll have a city icon, and there's just event locations, which are those yellow ones and those green ones. The green ones are in a forest, the yellow ones are in the desert. We have blue ones, which are on sea. And we can sort of decide how far we want to go. You'll also notice there are numbers on the city. There's desert locations. Those are going to impact the events that happen there. So if the higher the number, the more difficult the event is going to be as we encounter it. So a 2 is pretty safe. It's pretty straightforward. The 5 is going to be a more complex adventure or encounter that we have there. So once we've decided where we want to go, in this case the city, we're going to pull over or take an event card, and that's going to tell us what we're going to do in this event. So this is where the unique kind of storytelling element of the game comes in, and this is where players get to interact with each other. So what we notice here is that at the top of it, it says Alexandria. And if we make it to Alexandria, this sort of gives us a quest, then we get to have a special encounter. That's where we would roll a dice, and depending on the number that we get, we would get those bonus points. So if you 3, you'd go up Destiny 1, 4, Destiny 2, etc. But what we need to do for this encounter, as we work our way towards Alexandria, is we go to the bottom of the card and we notice there's a 22. And so what we do is that 22 is going to tell the player to our left that in the book that they have, the Book of Tales, they're going to need to look up the story or the interaction of number 22. To do this, we go to a sort of matrix building process in the game, and we look at paragraph number 22, and this is going to tell us one of 12 things of which we can do. So the idea here is that we have encountered something, and this is going to determine what we have encountered. So to determine what we encounter, we're going to roll a dice. But before we do that, we have to add up a couple of different things. First, we look at our destiny marker. Because we just started the game, it's at 0. But as we move through the game and that destiny marker goes up, that will also increase a point value system and make our encounters more difficult. We also look at the city. So we were in Alexandria in this case, and that had a point value of 2. That's what those numbers were. That's what makes it more difficult. And so we would add that 2 to our dice roll. So what we're going to do in this case is we're going to add the destiny, which is 0, add the city, which is 2, and then roll a dice. And whatever we roll, we add those first 2 numbers to it. So if we roll the dice, we roll a 5. So we add our 2 to it, which is 7, which means that we're going to be encountering the guarded treasure. So what this also tells us is that we're going to be entering reaction matrix E. So the player who is encountering is then going to determine how their player might react to this room. So there's this reaction matrix that we utilize to determine some of those things, but the reaction matrix also on our player aid, we have a set of information. So you'll notice here that there's an E, and so we'll go to that E, and depending on who our character is, so remember we're sort of a sly, sleuth, sneaky character, we might decide how we would interact or engage the treasure room. So we might examine, we might take, use, open, avoid, sneak, hire, help, or enter. And so this is where the storytelling element comes in. We have to decide how we would react to the situation. So in this case, because we're sneaky, we probably sneak into the room itself. So then once we have decided what we're going to be doing, we tell the player to our left that we're going to be sneaking into this guarded room. And so they will look at this matrix, and that tells them what story to tell us. So they will look at guarded for the treasure room. They will go over to sneak, and they will look at it tells us number 1102. Now, in order to make some variability to the game and to change things up, we need to do one more thing. And what we're going to do is we're going to roll a destiny dice. It's a simple dice. There's a couple of different sides. Really, it's a plus or a minus. And when we roll it, it will move that number, that 1102, either up 1 or down 1. So here's the dice. It's got that plus or minus. We roll it, so it goes plus. So 1102 means that we'd go to our storybook and that we'd read number 1103. So the player to our right then takes that number, and we go to this rather thick book of all of this information, and we scroll through it to number 1103. There's a lot of different information. There's a lot of really great stories. There's a lot of various interactions that happen. This is one of the really exciting parts about the game, is there's so many different things that can happen to your characters that it changes the game every time, and you really have to play your character role to think about what would they actually be doing in the situation. So in this case, we've gotten to the page, and 1103 looks like it's at the bottom there. So we'll go to that, and we'll kind of read this story and determine what happens to our character. So here, remember, I originally had 1102. We had that destiny dice, which told us that we should go up 1. So then we go down to 11 or up to 1103. In this case, then the story is that our character plans to rob an infidel temple. And so we begin to hire useful people instead of sneaking in. We hire them. So if we don't have any, what are the skills that we would have chosen, right? That if we don't have any, we do this with the first action. If we do have the bass trumpet, then we would choose that one. But since we don't have that bass trumpet, we notice that one of the men, a disguised infidel, betrays your plans. You are taken captive. In a series of bizarre rituals, your memory of all that has occurred is erased. So you're ensorcelled. You do get a destiny +1, but ensorcelled means that other players now get to determine where your character goes. So this is just one consequence of engaging these sort of interactions in the game, is that we might fall victim to other players in the game. So there are multiple things that can happen across this game and multiple interactions. This is just one way that it occurs, but one of the unique elements about this game is that we get to tell these really creative and fun stories about what happens to our characters, and our other players are involved in that storytelling element as well. So again, this is not your traditional board game. There's not a whole lot of rules or a lot of skills that's built into this. It's really about your interactions with your character, the events that happen to you, and the stories that you tell from these interactions. So the idea for the lesson today and what we'll talk about is how narrative is built in structurally. The story, so here we have Tales of 1001 Arabian Nights. That's a very structural narrative that we tell. But we also have narratives that evolve out of the game, out of the interactions that we have with the game structures, and that's really the focus of this game. How do we tell narratives, or how do we develop narratives throughout the multiple interactions? It's a really fun game. Again, it's more of an experience than it is your traditional style of game, but this works really well to illustrate the ways that narrative develops in multiple ways. So in this week's lecture, we're talking about meaning and narrative, and again, connecting that to the Tales of Arabian Nights. So what we want to seek to do in this lecture is to remind us that to play a game is to move into a magic circle, a space that we've created with the rules and structures of ourselves that are paired with narratives, and to move from the domain of everyday life into a special space of meaning. And it is within this special space that the players engage with a system that guides meaning making and representation. It tells us what things mean in a unique way. So the context of play affects how players understand and act upon the representations that you, the game designer, have created. And it's the system and the contexts that are both working hand in hand to support player interpretations. So it's important to remember what are we designing and how are we designing that structure to make the most meaningful sense of play. So one of the first things that we'll talk about is the play of meaning. And in this context, we have a formal system. Games are a formal system. They're meant to be meaningful in some way. So the game has to be played, though, in order for that meaning to be expressed, in order to engage that formal system. So we may have a set of rules, which is expressed here by the Arabian Nights rule set. This is what game scholars call the ludic structures, the game elements, the rules that we have. We can't do anything with those rules until we start to play with them, though, to engage them directly. So on the engagement side, the opposite end of the ludic is padia, the act of play. What we're doing is a very free-form thing. So in between the ludic and the padia structures, we create and create meaning within the game structure. So we want to remember that the focus here is that how do games represent? How do they create meaning for players through representation, and how are these meanings manipulated? So when we create games, we're going to think about how do we create meaningful elements of expression for players to engage with. So a part of this playful meaning is the act of representation. So we want to remember two things that games can represent. They can represent complex systems themselves. And so that's chains of signifiers, processes that give systems meaning and allow players to react. There's multiple elements that are going on, and so they represent something itself. And that the meaning of any one sign can only be understood in relation to the larger sets of signs. Within the game, this makes sense. This icon is understandable. We know what to do in relation to the game structure. And when those are paired together, there's a density woven fabric or a process of meaning making in the game. And this creates what we've deemed feedback loops, right? Where we do something in the game, we create a narrative arc in Arabian Nights, we act with our character, that character has feedback, they gain a skill in some way, and that gives us reason to act again in the game. So feedback loops tell us what we're doing, how we're progressing, and what we might do in the future. Games are also a representation. They reflect context themselves, so games can be a metaphor in this sense. To put those context and that meaning-making process into perspective, we also need to think about the way that what are the relationships between the rules and the meaning sets. So the system of a game's meaning is the set of formal relationships defined by the rules. What do the rules allow us to do? It's the pre-existing structure of signs that don't change from game to game, right? That's the static state of games. So rules, the context of interaction, help to establish what things mean. We know going into a game what we're supposed to do, and they do so by creating very specific sets of conditions. We limit players' understanding to help guide their play and what is meaningful. So rules guide this interaction. They establish relationships between signs, tell players what things mean, and then a meaning emerges from how we engage with those rules themselves. So the context of a game's meaning is that space of experience, where interpretation takes place, where we're structured to play, and how we engage that process of meaning making. So for example, within the game Arabian Nights, We have a clear center, Baghdad. We know where to start in the game, and actually one of the way you have to end the game is by going back to Baghdad. So Baghdad both starts as the origin point and the concluding point of the game. We know that the roads, the dashed lines, tell us these are the paths that we can move. We have the various cities, Damascus here or Basra. We can go to those cities and those are going to give us different encounters. We then have world locations, the green or the gold or the blue. Different events are going to happen there. Those become easy symbolic systems to work with. So we know what to expect when we go to those experiences. And these also transfer across games. We know in other games if there's a dashed line or there's icons that some sort of event is going to happen there. So there's a system of representation, a system of meaning that both comes from other games and it's also built into this game and it tells players what to do. And then we develop meaning out of the interactions with those symbolic systems. So as game designers, what I would encourage us to think about is when we do build systems or symbolic elements into our game, how does this match up with the rules? Are we utilizing these effectively? How do we build knowledge into the game, or in what ways are we building knowledge into the game board structure? And we can do this in simple ways, but these icons tell us that we're doing something. And so we really want to think about what sort of symbolic systems are we using in our game design. So as we move from symbolic systems to narratives, we want to think about the relationship. How do these pair with each other? How do they relate and connect as well? So we want to make sure that our symbolic structures support our narratives. So in this process, we want to remember that narratives, it's not a question of whether games are narratives, but how do we engage those systems? Again, there's a debate in game studies, ludology, so the study of those game structures themselves, the rules, how do they create meaning? And then narratology, what's the narratives that are important? We need to focus on that. We can go back and forth in between. We need to be cognizant of how both of these work, how narratives are being created and how the structures frame knowledge. And to also then consider that narratives are formed by rules, they're formed by our player interaction, and they're formed by game designers. So to address this structure, we need to understand that the rules and experiences through play is how games create a space of possible actions that players learn to activate, they learn to manipulate their engagements and the rules, and they get to explore and transform. And that transformation is both in the board, their characters, their interactions. That happens in multiple ways. But when we frame this space of possibility, that magic circle, as a narrative space, a special set of questions arise. When we ask, where do narratives in a game reside? In what ways are we creating narratives for players? How can one design games as a narrative experience, as the actions that we do, how is that part of the narrative experience? And what kinds of narrative experiences do games make possible in various ways? So Arabian Nights, a very specific type of narrative emerges from the gameplay there as we work to create these narratives for our players. And then finally, what is the role of narrative in the design of meaningful play? For some games, like Arabian Nights, it's the focus of the game. For other games, it's not. And so we want to think about when we create narrative engagements, narrative structures, and broad narratives for our games, how much of that are we incorporating into our game design, and how much do players get to utilize in forming their own narratives? So in traditional narrative structures, there's a couple things that we need to think about. One is the situation. This might be the overall or overarching situation that players engage with within that narrative. What are they trying to overcome or address? These also might be more contextual, so each player has their own situation or series of events that they're working through. So in Tales of Arabian Nights, we have those quest cards, and those change the situation in which the player will engage the game. So there's very contextual cues. We also have the character. What is the player doing? How are they being represented in the game? And then finally, the form, right? What is that larger representation or theme that happens? What are the things that our character does in that game? So in Arabian Nights, if you have that thief character, you might repeat those thief-like actions throughout the game. This helps structure the ways that you engage with the rules. Because of those situations and multiple characters, narratives are become expressed in a couple of ways. One, through the embedded narratives. That's the pre-generated content that's a part of the game. That's what the designers structure our play through. But we also have, and maybe more importantly with Arabian Nights, we have the emergent narratives, which is these are the things that arise out of the gameplay, the game rules, the interconnected activities that players have. And these are linked to the interactions of players and then to the rule systems themselves. So really this is how players tell the story of their play. How do we engage with something? What might we tell other players after the game is done? Really that's the emergent forms of narratives, what we're doing in context with the game. And this, especially for Arabian Nights, is the most important and interesting element of the mechanics, is that we really get to tell and have stories emerge out of the gameplay much like Werewolf does itself. The stories come out of our interactions. As we move through the game and we have different meanings that arise out of our design of the game, this design structure paired with the narrative elements that we've built into our game gives different goals. And those, as designers, we want to build in goals that help structure the narrative play, the ways that players interact with what is going on. And so interactions can be developed through story detail. What do players add to the interactions? But a game's goal or the series of goals is part of the narrative context that make up the game. When goals are well designed to support narrative play, a player's interactions with the game world becomes more meaningful, becomes consistently meaningful. And as usual, the discernibility and integration of meaningful play is critical in designing a strong narrative structure. So to create a strong game, much as we would to create a strong narrative, we need to build in some sort of conflict. And that conflict is a characteristic that shapes narrative play. So we should always have some element that works against player success. How do we limit players in the game? How do we build in challenges? So because conflict presumes a struggle between opposing forces, in a game there should always be some sort of element that works against our success. That tries to ensure our failure, but this role is often taken by a villainous character, or maybe in a cooperative game, the board itself. It's a competing player or team. And from the narrative perspective, this element, it motivates and contextualizes player interaction. The conflict of a game also infuses every moment of play itself. To maximize the narrative play in your game, you must pay close attention to how the conflict's narrativized. And when conflict provides a narrative context for action, your players will help tell the story of the game. They will infuse their own actions with narrative meaning. A final part of this process of building in conflict and that narrative goals and those structures is uncertainty. And this goes with the idea of variability within gameplay itself. So the uncertainty of the outcome is linked to that dramatic event. We don't know what's going to happen. We're more invested in what's going on. If gameplay is random, then that can build upon tension. And when we're playing with other players, if it's competitive in some way, that can fuel that engagement with other individuals. So in the narrative play, though, the unknown outcome of the game, right, the sections of the game, not knowing what's going to happen, is synonymous with the unknown outcomes of the narrative. Because we play through those roles, we play through those structures, we're engaging a game context, and we only tell the story, we only know what's going to happen with the story as we get towards the end. And so we directly engage that. That's one of the compelling parts of games, is that we are actively participating in the narrative storytelling process. And while many games utilize multiple ways to engage narrative and story context, again, Arabian Nights offers a really unique way to engage this. We do have this interactional matrix that helps guide our interactions. So when we come to that interaction, it tells us what to do, whether it's an A, F, K, E section. We decide what actions we're going to do. That leads us somewhere in that matrix. And then we move on to the story, right? So we have both interaction with the card that we've drawn. We then choose an action, or we're motivated in some way to act. And then we have a story that tells us. So we can develop our character's personality, their persona, in multiple ways by dictating how they would react to a situation. And if we keep that consistent, we really create a unique character in this sense. Other games develop character context in different ways. Many of them aren't as narratively themed as this, but it's important context to think about. How do you align consistency with narrative storytelling in your game? Narratives can therefore be expressed in multiple ways, and one way is pairing it with just core mechanics. So when considered as a narrative activity, the game can create stories by having players perform narrative acts. What is it that we do? So we might design moment-to-moment interactions. The traveling from spot to spot in Arabian Nights is part of that core mechanic of telling that story. So designing those moment-to-moment interactions as narrative play means paying attention to exactly what players are doing in your game, how their choices and outcomes are represented, and how these moments fit into larger narrative frames that you're trying to create. So by recognizing games as a narrative experience means considering them not just as bits of a plot that are arranged and rearranged through interaction, but instead considering them as an ongoing activity in which a player engages a core mechanic to make meaningful choices expressed in the game. And in designing games, you aren't simply creating context, you are creating sets of actions, a series of stylized behaviors that individuals do. And so what are your players actually doing from moment to moment is a good question to consider. More importantly, how can you craft these core mechanics to effectively embody the narrative experiences you have in mind? Another part of the narrative experience is really considering the space that you're designing. So space plays a large role in shaping those narratives. So you may consider the ways in which the board itself constructs the narrative elements. So different games like tiling or static boards or exploration boards, different board styles can change the ways that you express narratives. We also want to think about how time and space can increase that narrative tension. So one thing to do is to pay careful attention to the ways that your game creates an organized space. We also may want to consider, like, does seating arrangement change the design? Do we structure players in different ways in that context? Will players be able to hold multiple cards, or is there hidden information perhaps behind a screen in some way? How do we hide that information? In every game you create, consider how the design of the space weaves together the formal elements and experiential elements to represent and facilitate the stories you want to tell. So questions you consider really fall in line with what am I going for and how do we create that experience. For example, in Arabian Nights, we have a very static board. It doesn't move a whole lot. The player interactions change that narrative. In Steam Park, which we have listed below here, you start off with a small square, and then you can add tiles onto it. So you'll notice on the right here, you can tell that there's tiles with just one building on each of them that have been added to it. But space is also three-dimensional in this context. It builds up. So it changes the way that we engage play, and space also becomes a limiting function for the game design itself. In Carcassonne, we're tile laying, we're moving paths and tiles around, and we are sort of colonizing those spaces. So we're utilizing the tiles to develop a structure as we move through this countryside and how we control that countryside together. So think about the ways in which we engage space, the ways that players work through that space, and how might that parallel with the narrative or experiences that we're trying to create. So one thing we also need to consider is that there are narrative descriptors, which are all of the components of a game that participate in a system of representation. So the idea here is that everything in a game is potentially a kind of narrative descriptor. Thinking in terms of narrative descriptors means framing the elements inside and outside of a game as objects that communicate the story. What are all of the contexts that we're creating? As players, we rely on narrative descriptors to help us make sense of the setting, of the events, of the characters encountered. And although our narrative descriptors bear some relation to the formal structure, the rules of the game, they are also separate from it. So every element of a game, therefore, brims with narrative potential. The narrative components, all of the things you make of the game, are not just backstories, but they're a representational element that can be a descriptor. There are opportunities for you to communicate the story that you want players to experience. This ranges from instructions to the components to the pieces to the design of your cards. But we want to always keep this in mind when we're designing our games and to maximize the narrative. So for example, in Arabian Nights, we have the characters, right? That kind of tells us a little bit of story about who we might be. We have very specific locations on the board, and as we move through those, we get different stories. But more importantly, in this game, if you move into Europe, the game design allows you to encourage more rainy climates. We have a different lore that becomes expressed. So each region of the game has different types of encounters that you'll work with and work through. And that really is an opportunity to tell you about the vast world that your characters are expressing. We have multiple cities. Those cities have different encounters. We have locations. Some are forested, some are aquatic, some are in the desert. And again, in each of those, we have different experiences. So there's always multiple opportunities to tell the story in different ways, to move through the game and engage that narrative structure. So by creating game narratives means that playing in the realms of culture and engaging with all of these concepts and creating multiple representational frameworks for players to work with. Finally, to think about the game as a narrative system, as a system of meaning making, we really want to consider and recognize that we are creating systems of parts, simple elements that interrelate, that connect together to form a complex whole. So the meaning that emerges from this process of this system tells individual relationships and narratives in different ways. It brings together global patterns that emerge across multiple smaller relationships, and it really expresses meaning. And so fundamentally, I want you to consider it as the idea that you're crafting systems of parts, right? And emergent meanings that come from this process of storytelling. So how do we, so think about ensuring that our components work together in creative ways. So in conclusion, and to formalize some of this lecture, I want to present you with some takeaways. Always to remember that we are designing representation and meaning within the context of our games. And this happens both through the design of our elements and the relationships of the components and rules, that interaction between all of the complex sets. And in doing so, we create narrative structures on the outset as we design them, but we also allow emergent narratives to come through in the form of play. When we make a move, we're telling part of that story. So goals should reinforce this. We should have forms of conflict that drive interaction and then, again, tell that narrative story. We build in uncertainty to increase tension, and to be recognized that each act that a player takes is part of that narrative. Every jump, every move, every roll of the dice is part of that narrative storytelling device. And so consider the spaces too. How far do we have to move? What engagements do we do? Is it two-dimensional? Is it three-dimensional? What does the space tell us? And then also note that the narrative descriptors and components of the game tell us something unique.